The flight moved smoothly through the skies, the first-class cabin resting in a hush of soft conversation and the rustle of pages, until, in one jarring moment, a flight attendant slapped a black woman across the face for all to see. What she didn't know was that the woman's billionaire husband was sitting just 2 rows behind, watching everything unfold in silence. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And if you love powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment like this one. She stood quietly at the front of first class, adjusting a soft shawl over her shoulders. Her name was Celeste. Her skin, rich and deep in tone, seemed to glow under the cabin lights. Her posture was poised, her face serene. She wore a gentle cream dress and simple nude heels, nothing extravagant but undeniably graceful. A few passengers glanced at her, then returned to their screens or papers. She didn't mind. She hadn't come to be noticed. She only wanted to fly in peace. Celeste switched her phone to airplane mode, tucked it into her bag, and settled by the window, her gaze drifting toward the golden light dancing across the afternoon clouds. For a moment, calm enveloped her. But peace never lasts long. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, offering rehearsed smiles and checking boarding passes, until her eyes landed on Celeste. Her name was Karenna. Her expression changed. The practiced grin faded. Her steps slowed. She walked past Celeste at first, then turned back as if having second thoughts. Her voice was curt, her words clipped. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said. "Are you certain you're in the right seat?" Celeste blinked, confused but composed. "Yes," she said softly, reaching into her handbag to retrieve her boarding pass. She handed it to Karenna, who barely looked at it before frowning. "This is a first-class ticket," Karenna said, her tone turning condescending, like she was explaining something to a child. "This section is for first-class passengers only." "I understand," Celeste replied calmly. "This is my seat." Karenna narrowed her eyes, still clutching the ticket. She tilted her head slightly and asked louder, "Are you traveling alone?" Celeste gave a quiet nod. "Yes." Karenna exhaled sharply, already sounding irritated. She returned the ticket slowly and stood up straighter. "I'll need you to remove your bag from the overhead and follow me to the back," she said, her voice firm. "There may have been a system mix-up." Celeste hesitated. "But this is the seat assigned to me." "I'm not repeating myself," Karenna cut in, louder now, impatient. People began to take notice. Some pretended not to look, but their eyes drifted between the 2 women. Celeste didn't argue. With quiet dignity she stood, retrieved her bag, and stepped into the aisle. Her hands trembled faintly, but she kept her expression steady. She wasn't there to cause trouble. She just wanted to fly in peace. But silence doesn't always protect you. As she stepped forward, Karenna muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Celeste to hear, "This is what happens when some folks try to pretend they belong." The words stung more than a slap. Celeste froze for a brief second. Her face stayed calm, but a tightness gripped her chest. Still, she said nothing and continued toward the back. That's when a voice rose behind her, calm, clear, composed. "Is that how you speak to passengers?" Karenna stopped in her tracks, shoulders going rigid. She turned slowly, and that's when she saw him, a man seated just 2 rows behind, silent until now. Watching, listening. His name was Dominic. He wore a tailored navy blazer, his phone resting on his lap. Not a wrinkle in his clothes, not an ounce of visible anger. But his presence shifted the air entirely. Celeste halted mid-step. Her eyes widened slightly. She knew that voice. She knew it very well. But no one else on that plane did. Not yet. Karenna's breath caught as her gaze locked with Dominic's. Something about the way he sat. So still, so unwavering, made her uneasy. She forced a thin smile. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice suddenly lacking the steel it had carried moments earlier. Dominic didn't answer right away. He looked at Celeste, still standing with her bag in her hand, then returned his gaze to Karenna. "I asked you a question," he said evenly. "Is this how you speak to all your passengers? Or just the ones who look like her?" The cabin fell silent. The words hung like fog, heavy, impossible to ignore. A woman near the window slowly lowered her phone. A man beside Dominic shifted in his seat. Karenna didn't reply, but everyone else was listening now. Karenna squared her shoulders, clinging to the last shreds of her usual authority. "Sir," she said, voice taut, "there's no real issue here. It might have been a glitch in the seat assignment. I was just following protocol." Dominic's eyes didn't blink. His voice remained low and controlled. "She showed you her boarding pass, didn't she?" Karenna nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but—" "And yet, you still told her to leave her seat." She opened her mouth to respond, but found no defense. Her words stalled and dissolved. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of an entire cabin. She turned stiffly back toward Celeste. "If you'll just take a seat in the back for now, ma'am, we'll sort this out once we're airborne." But Celeste didn't move. She stood frozen in place, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. Her eyes searched Dominic's face. He gave a small nod. "Calm. Final. Sit," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a decision. She paused for a moment, then quietly stepped back into her seat. She slid her bag gently under the seat in front of her and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Not once did she look at Karenna. She didn't need to. Karenna stood, stunned. Her gaze bounced between Dominic and Celeste, unsure if she should say more. But something in the silence held her back. Maybe it was the way the cabin had gone completely still. Maybe it was the quiet authority in Dominic's voice. Or maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to realize who he was. "I'll inform the captain," she mumbled, her voice hollow. Then she turned and walked away, her posture rigid. Dominic leaned back in his seat and picked up his phone, scrolling with a casual motion. His jaw was set, eyes fixed downward, but no one missed the tension riding beneath his stillness. Behind the curtain in the galley, Karenna's hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had dealt with fussy passengers before, even combative ones. But this was different. That man, his calm, his stare, it unbalanced her in a way she couldn't name. She took a slow sip, trying to ground herself. Beside her, one of the junior flight attendants, a soft-spoken woman named Lena, glanced over from the coffee prep area. "You all right?" Lena asked gently. "I'm fine," Karenna snapped, brushing past her. "Just resolving a seat mistake. The woman in 2A clearly doesn't belong up there. Probably slipped through during check-in." Lena frowned, but she had a first-class ticket. "I saw her board." "Tickets can be bought," Karenna replied sharply. "Doesn't mean the system didn't screw up." Lena started to speak again, but thought better of it. She'd learned early in her job. Don't argue with Karenna. Still, something didn't sit right. She watched silently as Karenna pulled out her tablet and began tapping furiously at the screen. In the cabin, Celeste sat as still as marble. Her fingers were clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window. But her thoughts churned, loud and fast. She hadn't even fully processed what had just happened. The humiliation had come swiftly, like a blow. Now, though no one was saying anything, she could feel the stares, the weight of being watched but not defended, of being othered in a space she had every right to be in. Just behind her, Dominic hadn't said another word, but his presence lingered like a shield she didn't know she needed. She hadn't expected him to be on this flight. He was supposed to fly out a day later. She hadn't told him her plans, hadn't told anyone. And yet, here he was, sitting behind her, watching it all. She remembered something he once told her during a very different injustice. Let them show who they are. Then I'll take care of the rest. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. But from the moment he spoke, everything changed. And Celeste knew deep down, this wasn't over. Not even close. A few minutes later, Renner re-emerged from the curtain, her posture stiff, her face taut with forced professionalism. She walked briskly down the aisle, checking seatbelts like everything was fine. But her eyes flicked nervously toward the cockpit. She had already radioed the pilot, Captain Rhodes, reporting what she called a confused passenger situation. She hadn't mentioned raising her voice. She hadn't mentioned the crowd of silent onlookers. And she certainly hadn't mentioned Dominic, because truthfully, she still didn't know who he was. But Dominic knew what she had said, and he wasn't going to forget. Celeste stared out the window, unmoving. She wasn't crying. Her face didn't flinch, but her jaw was locked, and a quiet storm sat in her chest. She reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered above the screen. Then she typed, "She tried to take my seat. She didn't believe my ticket. She embarrassed me in front of everyone." She paused, then hit send. Seconds later, her screen lit up with a response. "I saw everything. Stay where you are. Don't say another word. I've got it." She looked back down. Dominic didn't lift his head, didn't glance over, didn't need to. The wheels were already turning. At the front of the aircraft, the cockpit light blinked softly. Captain Rhodes picked up the crew line. "Yes?" Renner's voice came through, calm on the surface but edged with tension. "Captain, we may have a situation in first class. A passenger in 2A, possibly seated incorrectly. There's been some confusion." Captain Rhodes frowned. "Does she have a valid boarding pass? I haven't checked the manifest yet. But I think—" "You think," he interrupted, voice firm. "Double-check now." "Yes, sir," Renner answered quickly, realizing her mistake. "And don't cause a scene." Back on the crew line, Renner's voice came through the headset, unnervingly calm for what she was reporting. "Captain, there may be an issue in first class," she said. "The woman in seat 2A. I believe she's in the wrong place. There's been some confusion." Captain Rhodes furrowed his brow. "Does she have a valid boarding pass?" There was a beat of hesitation. "I haven't checked the manifest yet," Renner admitted, her voice faltering. "But I think—" "You think," the captain snapped, his tone now sharp. "Check it, fast, and do not make a scene." "Understood," she said quickly, then hung up, her throat dry as she swallowed hard. Back in the cabin, Dominic slowly lifted his head. His eyes settled on the curtain Renner had just disappeared behind. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stillness said everything. He looked like someone who already knew how this story would end, even though they hadn't reached cruising altitude yet. The engines hummed low, signaling the plane's final checks before takeoff. Around him, passengers adjusted their belts and shifted in their seats, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place. In first class, the air had grown thick, not with turbulence, but with tension. Celeste leaned her head against the window, pretending to admire the soft layers of clouds rolling in the distance. But her mind wasn't floating. It was spiraling. The sting wasn't on her skin. It was deeper, seated in her chest. The way Renner had looked at her, the way she questioned her, as if her very presence was a mistake, and worst of all, no one said anything. Not one passenger had intervened. Not one person asked if she was okay. Only Dominic. She hadn't even seen him during boarding. She had assumed he was on a different flight, scheduled for tomorrow. But the moment she heard his voice, calm, firm, steady, something inside her shifted. Not because he was her husband, but because, in that moment, he had reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten. That she was worthy. That she didn't have to shrink. Behind the curtain, Karenna now held the printed manifest in her hands, gripping it tighter than necessary. Her eyes scanned the list once, then again. There it was. 2A, Celeste Renner. Paid in full. First class. No upgrade. No mistake. Everything in order. But Karenna still struggled to believe it. Or maybe, deep down, she didn't want to believe it. Something about Celeste had unsettled her. The quiet confidence, the effortless grace, the way she had claimed her seat without flinching. She didn't act nervous or unsure, didn't fumble with her bag or look out of place, and that, somehow, was the problem. Karenna folded the manifest and shoved it back into the folder with unnecessary force. At the back counter, Lena watched her quietly. She was on the list, Karenna muttered under her breath, like an accusation instead of a confirmation. I figured, Lena said softly. Karenna didn't respond. She stepped toward the curtain, stopped, then hesitated. Her hand hovered above the fabric, then dropped. Do you know who that man was? She asked suddenly, without looking at Lena. Lena looked up. Who? The one who spoke up. He's sitting in 4C. There was a pause. Lena tried to remember. I didn't catch his name, but he didn't seem like someone you'd want to argue with. Karenna's eyes narrowed. She remembered his face, not with fury, not with outrage, but with disappointment, and somehow that hurt more. He had looked at her like she'd revealed something she couldn't take back. Meanwhile, in his seat, Dominic was already moving with purpose. He tapped a short message into his phone. Contact legal. I want the cabin recording pulled upon landing. Notify operations. I expect a debrief scheduled immediately after arrival. He hit send and placed his phone face down on the tray. Across the aisle, a businessman who had watched the confrontation tried to catch his attention. He opened his mouth, then thought better of it. There was something about Dominic's silence that discouraged small talk. Without turning her head, Celeste spoke softly, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the engines. You were supposed to fly tomorrow. Dominic's voice came back, just as soft. Plans changed. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting that sink in. She didn't ask how long he'd been on board. She didn't ask what he was going to do next. She didn't need to. She knew him too well. Dominic never moved without reason, and if he had changed his flight, unannounced, it meant something had told him this was coming. The plane began to taxi. The soft voice of Captain Rhodes came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and providing the estimated flight time. No one in first class was listening. They weren't thinking about the weather at the destination or the complimentary drinks. They were too aware of what had just happened and of what was quietly still unfolding. Karenna returned to the cabin, walking with mechanical precision. She passed by Celeste without a word. She didn't look at her, didn't glance at Dominic, but she could feel it, his eyes, following her, with every step. Karenna moved through the aisle, tray in hand, her voice light and performative as she offered drinks. Water? Juice? Coffee? Her tone sounded cheerful enough, but something in her rhythm had cracked. The confidence she once carried like a uniform was slipping. She wasn't in control anymore. And Dominic hadn't raised his voice once. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, and passengers began to shift, loosening belts, settling into books, or making idle conversation. But not in first class. There, the silence clung to every corner. Celeste hadn't unfolded the blanket on her lap. She hadn't touched the magazine tucked into the seat pocket. She sat upright, arms gently crossed, her gaze fixed. Her body was calm, but her thoughts were not. She wasn't angry in the way people typically picture anger. Not wild, not loud. It was quiet, compressed, like a weight in the center of her chest, the kind of anger you learn to carry without showing. She had lived with grace all her life, never demanding attention, never asking for trouble. But today reminded her just how easily people looked at her and saw someone who didn't belong. And Karina hadn't just questioned her seat. She had questioned her right to exist in that seat. Meanwhile, Karina was doing what she always did when things slipped out of her grasp, pretending nothing was wrong. She moved down the rows, her smile automatic, her voice friendly, her routine crisp. But her hands weren't steady. As she leaned down to place a drink on the tray for the man in 1D, her fingers trembled, just slightly. Enough for him to notice. She wasn't just serving beverages anymore. She was waiting. Waiting for Dominic to say something. Waiting for Celeste to report her. But neither of them had spoken again. And that silence, it was worse. In the galley, Lena stepped toward her, voice gentle. "You want me to take the next round?" Karina gave a brisk shake of her head. "No, I'm fine." But she wasn't. She glanced past Lena, toward the curtain separating them from first class. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes. The gaze of that man, Dominic, burning into her from the back of her mind. His expression wouldn't leave her. So calm, so certain, like he knew something about her that she hadn't wanted to admit. Toward the rear of the plane, another crew member quietly approached Lena, slipping her a folded note. Lena's brow arched slightly as she scanned it. She gave a small nod and turned toward the cockpit. Karina didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. She already knew. Whatever it wasn't going to be good. She turned back to her cart, pretending to organize drinks, trying to keep her hands busy, her focus sharp. But up front, things were already in motion. In his seat, Dominic lifted his phone again. No flourish, no drama. Just one line typed with steady fingers. "Have the in-flight supervisor meet me before landing. Quietly. I want it handled discreetly, but thoroughly." He placed the phone face down and folded his hands. Celeste leaned back slightly, eyes still on the clouds beyond the glass. "You're already handling it, aren't you?" she asked without looking at him. Dominic was quiet for a moment, then tilted his head just a fraction. "I told you once," he said softly, "people show you who they are when they think no one's watching." She nodded slowly. She remembered when he'd said that. It was years ago, after a store clerk had followed her through a boutique like she might steal something. Now here they were again, 30,000 feet in the air, witnessing the same story unfold. Same truth, different uniform. Karina returned to Celeste's row, carrying a small cup of sparkling water. She placed it on the tray slowly, her voice clipped and quiet. "Here you go, ma'am." Celeste turned her head. Their eyes met. "No, thank you," she said. Her voice wasn't cold, it wasn't sharp, just quiet, controlled, but it echoed like a verdict. Karina froze, still standing by her row, unsure whether to say more. Then she turned to go. As she walked away, she heard it, a murmur behind her. "She didn't even apologize," someone whispered. Karina flinched. She didn't turn. She just kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard. But she had, and so had others. In first class, something had changed. The same passengers who had sat silently through the confrontation now watched everything. Some glanced over with discomfort, others with quiet guilt. They had seen it happen. A woman questioned, humiliated, reduced, and they had done nothing. Dominic hadn't needed to raise his voice. Celeste hadn't needed to cry. The truth had already found its way into the silence. It was sitting in every seat now. like a quiet weight pressing on every conscience. And Karenna, she was finally beginning to understand what it meant to lose control. The engines hummed steadily, fading into the background as the flight continued. But in the cabin, an uneasy stillness lingered. Passengers adjusted their blankets, flipped half-heartedly through magazines. But their eyes? They kept drifting back to Celeste, not because she was making a scene, but because her silence made them uncomfortable. Her presence made them remember what they saw, and how they said nothing. A woman in seat 1A clutched her purse tighter, pretending to read a novel she hadn't turned a page of. A young man a few rows back glanced toward Dominic, then quickly away. No one dared speak, but everyone was listening now. 2 rows back, a man kept stealing glances at Dominic. At first, he hadn't made the connection, but now it clicked. That face, the calm authority, the quiet presence, it was familiar. He'd seen it in tech journals, on leadership panels, speaking in news interviews about equity and innovation. That man in the tailored blazer, who had calmly stepped in to defend a humiliated woman without raising his voice. That was Dominic Renner, the founder of one of the most influential technology firms in the country. The man known for commanding entire boardrooms with a whisper. And until now, no one on that plane, not the passengers, not Karenna, not even the captain, had realized he was on board. Lena returned from the cockpit and leaned toward Karenna, her voice low and urgent. "You need to go up front," she said quietly. Karenna turned to her, frowning. "Why? What's going on?" Lena hesitated, then added, "The captain wants to speak with you. Right now." Karenna followed, her steps stiff, each one heavier than the last as she walked down the narrow aisle. This time, passengers didn't avert their gaze. They watched her. Some openly, some with quiet judgment. She tried to maintain her composure, but her pulse quickened with every step. At the cockpit, she knocked softly. Click. The door unlocked. Inside, Captain Rhodes sat stone-faced at the controls, his expression unreadable. Next to him, on the secure crew video screen, was the in-flight operations manager, a serious-looking man with a loosened tie and eyes that had seen enough. "Karenna," the captain began, his tone flat, "we've received a direct call from the corporate office. There's been a formal complaint filed regarding a passenger interaction in first class." Her heart dropped. It was a misunderstanding," she stammered. "The passenger, she was in 2A. I thought there was confusion over the seat." "Did she show you her boarding pass?" The man on the screen, Mr. Calder, interrupted, his tone sharp. Karenna hesitated. "Yes, but I didn't realize. Did you verify her name on the manifest?" "I did, but only after." "So you asked her to move before checking her credentials?" Calder asked pointedly. She opened her mouth to explain, but Captain Rhodes raised his hand, silencing her. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice firm now. "The man in seat 4C is Dominic Renner." Karenna blinked. I didn't know that." "And the woman you humiliated," Calder added, "is his wife." The silence that followed filled every corner of the cockpit. Karenna's knees weakened slightly. Her breath caught. "He's already contacted legal," Rhodes continued. "He hasn't gone to the media. But he has every right to take this to the board. And from what I've heard, he's going to." She tried to find something, anything, to say. "It wasn't personal. I didn't recognize her. I was just following." "You didn't need to recognize her," Calder snapped. "You needed to treat her like any other passenger. And you didn't." The video screen went dark. Captain Rhodes turned to face her. "You'll need to apologize." "Not later. Now." Karenna looked at him, stunned. "And you'll do it in front of everyone who saw it happen," he said. "No excuses." Then he turned back to his controls. "Conversation over." Karenna stepped out of the cockpit like someone waking from a dream she couldn't escape. She walked slowly toward the first-class cabin, each step heavier than the last. The same passengers she had once passed confidently now stared at her, some curious, some cold, all aware. She had played this moment in her mind during the flight, imagining ways it might pass quietly. That Celeste would let it go, that no one would put the pieces together, that no one would realize who Dominic was. But all of that had collapsed. Now the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just turbulence. This was the start of a fall. She paused just past the curtain, hand on the wall for balance, her mouth dry, her legs stiff. She could still hear Captain Rhodes' voice echoing in her mind. "You created this situation. Now you fix it." She stepped forward slowly, her gaze sweeping the rows she had once walked with confidence. Now every face turned toward her. No more pretending. No more control. She reached row 2. Celeste sat with perfect poise, back straight, hands resting lightly on her lap. Not triumphant, not angry, just steady, as if she had already won, without raising her voice or lifting a finger. Behind her, Dominic sat motionless, his eyes locked on Karenna like a verdict waiting to be read. And she felt it, the weight of his gaze, heavier than a room full of judgment. She swallowed hard. Karenna crouched down slightly, her voice low, just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," she said, her words stumbling over themselves. "There was a misunderstanding earlier. I acted too quickly, and She paused, trying to gather what little control she had left. "I shouldn't have asked you to change seats. I'm sorry if I caused you any embarrassment." Celeste raised an eyebrow, not in anger, but in quiet curiosity. "A misunderstanding?" she asked gently. Karenna nodded quickly. "Yes. I didn't mean to offend you." "But you did," Celeste replied, her tone calm and clear. "You looked at me and decided I didn't belong here. That wasn't a system glitch. That was your judgment." Karenna froze. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes. Passengers who now leaned in, not physically, but emotionally, into this moment. Celeste's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was strength in the softness. "You didn't ask anyone else to show their boarding pass," she continued. "Not the man in 1C, not the woman in 3A. Only me." Karenna opened her mouth, searching desperately for something to say. An explanation, an excuse, a lifeline. But there was nothing. Behind them, someone murmured, "She's right." Another passenger nodded quietly. Still, Dominic said nothing. His silence only made the truth louder. Celeste leaned back in her seat, eyes still on Karenna. "So if you're going to apologize, at least call it what it was." Karenna stood there, exposed in front of the very passengers she used to manage with precision and control. Her hands twitched slightly at her sides. Finally, her voice cracked just a little. "I misjudged you," she whispered. Celeste nodded once. "That's the truth." She didn't say more. She didn't thank her. She simply turned back to the window and picked up her glass of water. The conversation was over. Karenna straightened slowly, her cheeks flushed, her legs unsteady. She turned and walked back toward the galley like she was walking into the wind. She couldn't meet anyone's eyes, not Celeste's, not Dominic's, not a single passenger's. She returned to the service area and stood still, her hand gripping the edge of the cart so tightly her knuckles turned white. Lena looked over quietly. "That was brutal," she said gently. Karenna didn't reply, because she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The cabin settled again, but it wasn't peace. It was a stillness laced with tension. Karenna didn't return to the aisle. Instead, she busied herself behind the curtain, rearranging items that didn't need rearranging, wiping trays that were already clean. Her hands kept moving, but her mind was stuck. The apology hadn't helped. If anything, it had made it all feel real. The moment she crouched in front of Celeste, the moment she admitted what she had done, she had crossed a line from the one who gave orders to the one being corrected. And the silence that followed her apology, it was the loudest sound she had ever heard. In first class, the quiet stretched long and wide. No one spoke much, but everyone was listening. It wasn't just about Karenna anymore. It was about them, about how no one had spoken up when it happened, about how easy it was to watch and stay silent. Now, they watched Celeste differently, not with judgment, not with pity, with something closer to quiet respect and unease, because they had seen, and they had looked away. Celeste sat with her arms resting lightly on the armrest, fingers slowly tracing the rim of her glass. Her face hadn't changed, but her thoughts raced. She hadn't expected the apology, and when it came, it had felt off. Not wrong, just incomplete, like Karenna had said what she had to say, not what she meant. It was the kind of apology people give when they're caught, not when they're sorry. She didn't want vengeance. She didn't want Karenna fired or dragged across headlines, but she did want something to change, because women like her had been pushed aside too many times, spoken to with polite masks and poisoned undertones, treated like outsiders in rooms they had paid to be in. She glanced back briefly. Dominic was still in his seat, reviewing something on his tablet, calm as ever. But Celeste knew him, knew the stillness he carried when he was preparing for something bigger. A few rows behind, a man leaned forward slightly. He was middle-aged, dressed in a gray sweater and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He cleared his throat softly. "I saw what happened earlier," he said, not quite meeting Celeste's eyes. It wasn't right." Celeste turned toward him. "No," she said simply, "it wasn't." He nodded once, then leaned back in his seat, unsure of what else to say. But that one moment, a passenger acknowledging what had happened, shifted the air just slightly. The reckoning was no longer silent. It had begun to speak. The man who had spoken up just moments earlier sat with his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. He didn't know what else to say, and maybe he didn't need to, because even that simple moment, just acknowledging it, shifted something in the air. Then another voice followed, this time from across the aisle. Quiet, sincere. "We all saw it," someone said. "We should have said something." Celeste didn't respond to that one. She didn't need to. The shame carried in their voices was enough. Up in the cockpit, Captain Rhodes tapped the intercom and connected with operations. His voice was calm, but clipped. "Begin arrangements for executive handling upon landing," he said. "Confirm with legal and with security." A voice responded through static. "Copy that. Mr. Renner has requested privacy for his wife, but wants a formal review started before touchdown." "Understood," the captain replied. He leaned back slightly, eyes scanning the endless sky beyond the windshield. This was no longer a routine flight. It was a moment the entire airline would be talking about before the day was over. Back in the galley, Karenna stood alone, one hand on the interphone. She hesitated, then slowly dialed a direct line to crew control. It rang once before a voice answered. "Crew support. Go ahead." Her voice was unsteady. "This is Karenna Doyle, flight lead on Flight 315. I need to file a preliminary incident report." She paused, eyes fluttering shut. "For crew misconduct. My own." There was a pause on the other end. "Copy that. Noted." She hung up and stood still for a long moment. Her shoulders sagged. She felt smaller with every breath, as if she was shrinking inside her own uniform. For years she had walked down aisles with authority. She corrected passengers, maintained order, commanded respect. She had become too used to being the final word. And now she was the subject of the report, filed in her own voice. Elsewhere, Celeste scrolled slowly through her phone. Notifications buzzed quietly, news alerts, emails, a few curious messages from people who had likely already sent something. But only one message mattered. It was from Dominic. She made a mistake. But what happens after? That's where the real lesson begins. Celeste exhaled slowly. She had a feeling Dominic wasn't going to stop at an apology. This was just the beginning. The plane continued its smooth cruise through the upper atmosphere, but inside the cabin, tension curled through every row like low fog. Conversations had dimmed to whispers. Glances were exchanged more often than words. People who had once been lost in work or comfort now sat unusually alert, aware. Even the silence was different now, dense with quiet accountability. Corinna hadn't returned to the aisle since filing the report. She remained tucked behind the galley curtain, arms crossed tightly over her chest, eyes locked on the floor. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel like a team lead. She felt like a file number, a code, a problem to be handled. She had spent years developing a sense for passengers, how to read people the moment they boarded, who fit, who didn't. But now, she had been wrong. And the shame wasn't just internal anymore. It was professional. Across from her, Lena glanced over, watching Corinna shrink into herself. After a quiet moment, she spoke. "I checked your file once," she said gently. "You've been flying for almost 11 years, right?" Corinna didn't look up. 13. Lena nodded. "Then you know how quickly things can change." Corinna gave a bitter, almost silent laugh. "Apparently not fast enough." "You're not the first to make a mistake," Lena said. "No," Corinna whispered, "but I might be the last one who gets to make this kind." Up front, Celeste finally closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to rest. She had been holding herself together for hours. Holding her body upright, her face composed, her presence calm. It was exhausting. This wasn't new, this performance of grace in the face of disrespect. Pretending that every sting didn't land, that every dismissal didn't echo. She had learned how to stay still, even when everything inside her boiled. Not because she was fragile, but because she had no other choice. Women like her were taught early that composure is survival. She exhaled and leaned back gently. And then she felt it. The shift beside her. Someone moved. She opened her eyes just slightly. Dominic had set aside his tablet. One arm rested casually across the armrest. His other hand lay still on his leg. His face hadn't changed. But his silence had weight. It filled the space more than any speech ever could. She whispered, "You don't have to do anything else." He looked at her, his voice as soft as hers. "That's not how I was raised." Then without ceremony, he reached up and pressed the call button above his seat. The soft chime echoed gently. Several heads turned. Moments later, Lena stepped through the curtain, composed and professional. "Yes, sir?" Dominic looked up at her evenly. "I'd like to speak to the in-flight supervisor," he said. Lena's voice didn't shift. "That would be Corinna, sir." Dominic nodded once. "Then please let her know. I'm ready to speak." Lena paused, only for a moment, then nodded and slipped behind the curtain again. Corinna felt her stomach drop the moment she saw Lena approaching. "He wants to speak with you." Her heart clenched, but she nodded slowly, wiped her palms on the hem of her apron, took a breath that didn't help. Her steps toward row 4 weren't hesitant, but they were heavy, each one dragging the weight of everything she knew was coming. She reached his row and stood beside his seat. "Mr. Renner, is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he replied. She swallowed hard. "Would you prefer to speak privately?" "No," Dominic said, his voice even. "Right here is fine." She nodded stiffly. "Okay." Dominic turned slightly in his seat to face her, composed and still. "I'm not going to raise my voice," he said, "and I'm not going to threaten your job." He paused. "I don't need to. What happened today?" Spoke for itself. His words hung in the air, not sharp, but direct, heavy. "You saw my wife," he continued, "and you made a decision about her before she said a word, before you checked a list, before you looked at her ticket." Karenna started to speak, but Dominic lifted a hand, just one finger, enough to silence her. "I'm not interested in excuses." His tone never rose, but it filled the space. "I'm not angry because you made a mistake," he said. "I'm angry because you were comfortable making it. You didn't hesitate. You didn't question yourself. You questioned her. Loudly, publicly, with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of getting away with it." Karenna's face flushed. She felt every word press against her. Dominic's voice dropped slightly, just above a whisper, but somehow every nearby passenger leaned in to hear. "You tried to shame her," he said, "and you did it in front of strangers. Because you thought she wouldn't say anything. You thought she'd just move." He glanced at Celeste, still seated, still silent. "She did move," he said, "not because she was wrong, but because she didn't want to give you a reason to go further." He paused. "She protected you from yourself." The truth of it struck like a drumbeat. Karenna couldn't breathe. Dominic leaned back slightly, his voice calm as ever. "The only reason you're still standing here, wearing that uniform, is because she gave you that chance." Silence. Not a word from the passengers, not a shift, not a whisper, only the weight of it all. Dominic didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Karenna's eyes were glassy, her throat tight. She gave a stiff, almost robotic nod, then turned to walk away. But before she reached the curtain, a passenger called out, "I hope you remember this day." She didn't look back. She just disappeared behind the fabric. This time, no one pretended not to watch her go. The rest of the flight passed like a breath no one could quite release. Time moved, but slowly. There was no chatter, no calls for extra drinks, no buzzers for blankets. Even the clink of ice in glasses felt louder than usual. First class didn't feel like a cabin anymore. It felt like a courtroom after a verdict. Celeste remained in her seat, composed. Not cold, not performative, just centered. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. She didn't need to demand respect. Her presence alone did the speaking. No anger, no drama, just truth. And that truth? It made people uncomfortable. In exactly the way it should. Dominic scrolled quietly through his phone, checking emails, replying with short, precise messages. Every movement had purpose, every action calculated. He had already submitted the incident report, requested cabin recordings, sent a list of passenger names and timestamps to his legal team. By the time they landed, the company's top legal officer and board liaison would have the entire case file waiting in their inbox. Not because Dominic wanted attention, because he believed silence often protects the wrong people, and he had no interest in protecting them. Behind the curtain, Karenna sat on the fold-down crew seat, alone, her hands clasped tightly between her knees. She had removed her blazer, wiped her face 3 times, but she couldn't wipe away what had happened. She tried to rehearse explanations in her mind, but none of them sounded right. Not one of them made her look decent, because deep down, she knew. She had looked at Celeste and decided, without reason, that she didn't belong. It wasn't policy. It wasn't protocol. It was something uglier, something inside her that she could no longer pretend wasn't there. And this time, the person she dismissed had power, sitting 1 row behind her. She rubbed her temples, trying to push back the pounding ache that had settled behind her eyes the moment she saw Dominic stand. Lena stepped in quietly, holding a small bottle of water. "You should drink something." "I'm fine," Corinna whispered, not meeting her gaze. Lena stood for a moment longer. "They're calling it already, you know," she said softly. Corinna looked up. "The ground team. I overheard the captain. There's security meeting the gate. Someone from corporate is with them." Corinna's shoulders dropped. Her voice cracked slightly. "Is that for me?" Lena didn't answer. She didn't need to. Back in the cabin, passengers had begun to whisper. Soft, uncertain conversations hummed between business travelers and couples. No one dared to speak too loud. But they were all talking about the same thing. A man in 3C leaned toward his wife. "You think she's going to lose her job?" His wife nodded. "She should." Across the aisle, a younger woman whispered, almost to herself, "I can't believe I just sat there." Even the passengers who hadn't been part of it were now asking the questions they had avoided earlier. Why didn't I say something? Would I have spoken up if he hadn't? Why was her presence questioned before her ticket? This flight wasn't just a journey anymore. It had become a mirror. The intercom crackled. Captain Rhodes' voice came through, polite but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, tray tables are stowed, and all personal items are secured." In her seat, Celeste took a slow, deep breath and clicked her seatbelt into place. She glanced toward Dominic, who gave her a soft nod. No words, just that look. "I'm here. I've always been here." She rested her hands in her lap and looked ahead. She didn't want revenge. She didn't need anyone to grovel. She just wanted accountability. Real accountability. Not a scripted apology. Not a discount code. Not a handshake behind a curtain. She wanted change. And if Dominic had anything to do with it, change was already underway. At the front of the plane, the cockpit phone buzzed again. Captain Rhodes picked it up, listened quietly, then nodded once before hanging up. He turned to the door with a sigh. "Mr. Renner's security detail has arrived at the gate," the voice had said. "The executive officer is with them. They're requesting to speak with the crew immediately upon landing." The captain had flown this route for over 15 years. He'd handled turbulence, engine trouble, emergency reroutes, but he'd never landed a flight knowing someone's career would end before the wheels touched ground. In the galley, Corinna stood slowly. Her body felt like it weighed twice what it did earlier. She adjusted her shirt, smoothed the front of her uniform, retied her hair into a perfect practiced bun. She'd done it 1,000 times. It used to give her control. Now it felt like armor that couldn't protect her. The chime sounded. The seatbelt light flickered on. Outside the windows, the city came into view. Roads, rooftops, sunlight breaking through scattered clouds. But inside, silence. The descent had begun. And so had the consequences. The plane landed with a gentle jolt, wheels grabbing the runway as the engines slowed them to a crawl. But there was no relief, no applause, no relaxed stretch from the passengers. Just stillness. A quiet, restrained kind of tension, as if everyone on board understood. The landing wasn't the end of the flight. It was the beginning of what came next. In first class, Celeste sat with her back straight, her expression calm, her gaze forward. She didn't glance toward the galley. She didn't fidget or fold her hands nervously. She waited. Like someone who had learned long ago how to sit through silence without shrinking, Dominic was just as composed. He placed his tablet in his carry-on, zipped it up, reached for his blazer. He moved like a man with time on his side, steady, unhurried, unaffected by the tension around him. But if you looked closely, you'd see it. He wasn't preparing for a meeting. He was preparing for a correction, a reset of the system that had allowed this moment to happen in the first place. The intercom buzzed again. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the captain, "welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. For your safety, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Thank you for flying with us." That robotic script had never sounded so cold. Ding! The seatbelt sign dimmed, but no one moved. All eyes went to the front of the cabin. The door hadn't opened yet. Behind the curtain, Karenna stood still, her back straight, her name badge polished, her uniform spotless. But nothing on her body could hide the storm inside. Her heart raced. Her hands twitched. She wasn't preparing for a customer complaint. She was preparing for judgment, because she knew exactly who would be waiting on the other side of that door. Then, click. The door unlatched, opened. The moment broke. Tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. A uniformed security officer stepped into the cabin entryway. He was tall, stone-faced, and silent. He didn't need to announce authority. He was authority. His voice was calm, but clear enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "Is Karenna Doyle on board?" The security officer's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Is Karenna Doyle on board?" Every head in first class turned. Karenna stepped out from behind the curtain, wearing a smile that couldn't quite reach her eyes. "That's me," she said softly. "Please gather your belongings," he replied, calm and clear. "You'll need to disembark immediately." The words landed like lead. A few passengers gasped. Others exchanged glances. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. This wasn't a policy memo behind closed doors. It was real, and it was unfolding in full view. Karenna hesitated only for a moment, then turned and retrieved her bag from the galley. She walked slowly toward the aircraft door, her head low but eyes flicking, just once, toward Dominic and Celeste as she passed them. Maybe hoping for mercy, for a nod, for anything. But neither blinked. They simply watched. When she reached the door, the officer stepped aside and motioned for her to go first. She nodded once stiffly and stepped into the jet bridge. What she didn't expect to see was who was waiting for her. Two airline executives stood just outside the plane, both in tailored suits, both wearing silver badges. Arms crossed. The older one, with silver hair and a clenched jaw, gave a single motion. "This way, Miss Doyle." She didn't argue. She followed. Inside the cabin, the silence didn't lift. If anything, it deepened. No one rushed to stand. No one touched the overhead bins. Everyone remained seated, watching, processing, absorbing the moment. Celeste finally stood. She moved with grace. No dramatics, no rush. She lifted her bag with ease, adjusted the strap over her shoulder, then turned to Dominic, who had risen too, his blazer perfectly buttoned, his expression as steady as it had been the entire flight. "You sure you want to walk out with me?" she asked softly, a half-smile tugging at her lips. He raised one brow. "I didn't fly across the country to sit quietly behind you." They stepped into the aisle together, heads high, not out of pride, out of principle. As they passed, a man in 3A stood briefly. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, clearing his throat. Celeste turned just slightly. I should have said something earlier," he admitted. "I'm sorry I didn't." She looked at him a moment, then gave a soft, gracious nod. "Thank you." Farther down the aisle, a woman stood too. "You handled it better than I ever could have." Celeste offered her a kind smile. "We all handle things differently," she said. "Some of us just don't have the luxury of loud reactions." No one else spoke. They didn't need to. By the time Celeste and Dominic stepped off Flight 315, the narrative had changed completely. She was no longer just the woman in 2A. She was the woman who was wronged, who held her ground, who walked off without raising her voice. And Dominic? He hadn't needed to cause a scene. He had simply witnessed the system at its worst, and ensured it didn't stay that way. Meanwhile, for Karena, the walk down the long corridor to the terminal's secured conference area felt longer than the entire flight. This wasn't a quiet exit. This was a procession, and at the end of it, a reckoning. The room they entered was sleek and sterile, enclosed in glass with soundproofed walls. A long conference table waited in the center, a single water bottle placed at her seat. Karena sat down slowly. Her hands knotted together in her lap, her knuckles pale. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above her. The silence was too loud. Every tick of the wall clock behind her felt like a countdown, not to a conversation, but to a collapse. 13 years in uniform, thousands of flights, hundreds of passengers. And now, everything she had built teetered on the edge, because of a moment she couldn't rewind. The door opened. 2 executives entered. The older one, silver-haired, hard-eyed, was the same man who had met her outside the aircraft. His badge read, Nathan Hale, Senior Director of In-Flight Operations. Beside him, a younger woman in a navy blue pantsuit closed the door behind her. Her name badge, Eliza Grant. She placed a slim folder on the table, slid into a seat across from Karena, and said nothing. Hale remained standing, arms folded. His voice was clinical. "Ms. Doyle," he began, "do you understand why you're here?" Karena nodded slowly. "Yes." "Then tell me," he said, "in your own words." She swallowed, her voice dry. "There was a misunderstanding. I questioned a passenger seat in first class. She showed me your ticket, but I still asked her to move." The woman, Eliza, opened the folder and flipped a page. "Why?" she asked plainly. Karena paused, then answered. "She didn't look like someone who usually flies first class." The words sat in the air like a confession. Uncomfortable. Exposed. Eliza didn't react. She simply jotted something down. Nathan Hale stepped forward slightly. "And when she complied?" he asked. "When she moved without creating a scene? You thought that was acceptable?" "At the time." "Yes," Karena said quietly. "But I know now it wasn't." Hale's expression didn't shift. "You didn't ask anyone else to show their ticket?" "No." "You didn't question the white couple who boarded just before her?" "No." "No," Nathan Hale said slowly. "You only questioned her." Karena nodded again, her face pale. "Yes." There was a pause. Nathan stepped back and finally took a seat, his voice softer now, but no less serious. "Do you know who her husband is?" "Yes," Karena whispered. "I do." Eliza looked up from her folder. "What do you think he's going to do with this incident?" I don't know," Karena said. "But whatever it is, I deserve it." Silence. Then Nathan spoke again. "We have the recording from the cabin security feed. We also have 7 passenger statements, the captain's report, and your own junior crew member's account." Karena closed her eyes briefly. "I believe them." "You should," Eliza replied, her tone unwavering, "because this isn't just a formal review anymore." Karena's eyes snapped open. "What does that mean?" "It means," Nathan said, "the executive board has been notified. The incident is now classified as a priority case, not only because of who was involved, but because Flight 315 exposed something deeper." He leaned forward. "You're not here just because of today. You're here because today gave us proof." Karena didn't speak, couldn't speak. She simply stared at the edge of the table, unable to look up. Nathan tapped the folder in front of him. "You're officially suspended," he said. "Without pay, effective immediately. A disciplinary hearing will be held within the next 10 business days. Until then, you are not to wear the airline uniform access internal systems, or enter any restricted terminals. He let that sink in. If any of those conditions are violated, your termination will be immediate. Karenna nodded slowly. On the surface, her face was still. But inside, something was breaking. Everything she had built, her routine, her rank, her reputation, it all unraveled in an instant. Because her instincts had failed her. Because she had misread a woman who never gave her a reason to doubt. And now, there was no uniform that could restore what was lost. The executive stood to leave. But before exiting, Nathan paused by the door. "If there's one thing you take from this," he said, "it's that people are tired." He looked her squarely in the eyes. Tired of being judged before they even sit down. And today, you showed them exactly why. Then the door clicked shut, and Karenna was alone. Across the airport, in a quiet lounge tucked behind frosted glass, Celeste and Dominic sat side by side. The room was dim. Comfortable, soft leather chairs, warm lighting, a wall of windows facing the tarmac. A private assistant entered silently, set down 2 cups of tea, and left just as quietly. Celeste took a slow sip, eyes steady on the horizon. "So, that's it?" she asked. Dominic shook his head gently. "That's the start." She raised an eyebrow. "There's more?" He nodded. "The board's meeting later this week. I've already submitted a full proposal." She leaned back slightly. "What kind of proposal? Mandatory bias training? Anonymous reporting system? Quarterly flight audits? Real-time feedback for passengers who experience discrimination?" She blinked. "You did all that in a few hours?" Dominic smiled, but only slightly. "I've been sitting on the plan for months," he said. "I was just waiting for them to stop pretending we didn't need it." Celeste folded her arms. "And now?" "Now," he said, "they don't have a choice." There was a long pause. Celeste looked down at her tea, then out the window toward the resting plane they had just left. "I didn't want her ruined," she said quietly. "I just wanted her to see what she did." "She will," Dominic said, "and she won't forget it." Celeste nodded slowly. Because the most powerful lesson didn't come from punishment. It came from being seen, not explained, not defended, just seen. As someone with the right to be there. As someone who never had to prove why. As the sun dipped lower outside, the lounge filled with golden light. Celeste took another sip of tea. A quiet calm settled in her chest. And in the distance, on the same runway where it had all unfolded, Flight 315 sat parked, its door now open, its silence broken, its truth finally seen. Gregory Stone, the CEO, sat in his office reviewing the internal memo. His jaw was tight. He had worked with Dominic before, once during a green aviation summit on airport sustainability. He knew Dominic Renner wasn't a man of empty movements, so if Dominic had been on that flight, if he had stayed silent until the very end, then it meant the damage had already been done. And now, the airline would answer for it. Across the city, in a quiet estate surrounded by tall trees and well-tended gardens, sunlight spilled through wide windows. Celeste stood barefoot in the kitchen, staring down at her phone. Her inbox overflowed. Messages from friends, colleagues, acquaintances. Many of them had read the anonymous post now going viral. The woman in seat 2A. No names, no airline mentioned. But the details were unmistakable. The words were clean and sharp. The story didn't need drama. The truth carried all the weight it needed. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She moved when told, and somehow became the problem, until the man behind her stood up. And everything changed. She didn't know who had written it. Maybe a passenger, maybe one of the quiet ones. But it didn't matter. The story had a life now, and people were listening. Dominic stepped into the kitchen, holding his phone in one hand and a folder in the other. He kissed her forehead gently and set both down on the counter. "The board called this morning," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "They've scheduled a full review of in-flight conduct and behavior protocols. The policy update will be mandatory, not optional." He paused. "They're naming it after you." Celeste stared at him. "What?" "It's not public yet," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. "Internally, they're calling it the Callaway Clause. No passenger can be removed, questioned, or reassigned without digital ticket re-verification." She absorbed the words slowly. Not out of pride, out of something deeper, out of change, real change. And it carried her name. She sat at the table, her voice quiet. "I didn't want all this attention." Dominic sat beside her. "You didn't ask for it." He met her gaze. "You earned it." She looked at him. "What about Karenna?" He was silent for a moment, suspended. Final decision pending. "She submitted a statement last night." He opened the folder and slid it across to her. Inside was a printed letter, typed, plain, but trembling with confession. "I made an assumption. I acted on it. And I hurt someone who did nothing wrong. This wasn't about a seat. It was about the lens I chose to see her through. And if this cost me my job, I accept that. Because she deserved better. And next time, someone else will too." Celeste read the letter in full, then lowered it gently onto the table. "She's not the only one who needed to read this," she said. Dominic nodded. "That's why I sent a copy to the board." A pause lingered, soft, still. Not all apologies fix what's broken. But this one mattered, because it named what was broken. And once something has a name, it can't go unseen again. Outside, morning sunlight crept across the garden. Inside, Celeste closed her eyes for a long moment, then opened them again, steadier now. "I didn't speak for a reason," she said. "I know," Dominic replied, "because I wanted them to hear their own silence." He nodded, and they did. She glanced down at the letter once more, then folded it neatly and placed it in the folder. "I'm keeping it." Dominic smiled softly. "Not for revenge," she said. "Not for victory." She looked out toward the trees. "But for memory, because some moments weren't meant to be shouted. They were meant to be remembered. And this one would be. By everyone on that plane. And everyone who had ever been told, without a word, that they didn't belong." 2 weeks later, the airline released a public statement. Not a press release. Not a tweet with 3 bullet points and a polished PR caption. A full video. Clear, candid, unscripted. The screen faded in from black. The camera showed the lobby of the airline's headquarters. Standing at a podium was a tall woman in a navy blue blazer. The airline's chief operating officer, Natalie Pierce. No teleprompter. No legal advisor whispering from behind the scenes. She looked into the lens and spoke. Steady, deliberate. "There are moments that define whether a company is truly listening," she began. Flight 315 was one of those moments. She paused. On that flight, a paying customer, Celeste Callaway, was subjected to racial bias, public humiliation, and improper treatment by a member of our in-flight crew. She didn't hedge. No, if she felt offended. No softened corporate filter. Just the truth. No passenger should ever be treated as though they don't belong, especially not in the very seat they paid for. Natalie Pierce stood tall at the podium, finishing her statement with words no one expected from a company long known for hiding behind its policies. "To Celeste Callaway," she said, her voice unwavering, "we not only apologize, we thank you for your grace, for your strength, and for choosing to stay seated when others would have walked away. Because of you, we are better." The video cut to black, and the world lit up. It didn't go viral because it was flawless. It went viral because it was real. Flight attendants shared it in crew forums. Passengers reposted it with their own stories, moments where they too had been asked to prove they belonged. But this time, it was different. This time, the silence had finally been broken. Back in her quiet kitchen, Celeste watched the statement on her phone. She was sitting in the same chair where she had first read Karena's apology. Sunlight filtered softly through the window beside her. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded once. Dominic stepped into the room, a cup of tea in his hand. He set it gently in front of her. "It's done," he said. She looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it?" "For now," he replied. "But not forever." She stirred her tea slowly, thinking. "But it has to start somewhere." He sat beside her, nodding. "And it started with you." She glanced back down at her phone. Her name wasn't trending. She hadn't posted a speech. She hadn't needed a microphone. Her story had moved, not through noise, but through truth. And enough people had finally decided to listen. A week later, a letter arrived. Handwritten, simple, no press release, no PR team involved. Just a name she hadn't expected. Karena Doyle. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I've stepped down. Not because I was forced, because I needed to face who I was becoming. Thank you for standing still. It made me finally move." Celeste read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, not to collect dust, but to remember, to mark the weight of moments that mattered. She stood at the window, looking out over the trees swaying gently in the wind. No audience, no spotlight. Just peace. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice. Not the loud kind, the lasting kind. Because this wasn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It was a story about what happens when someone refuses to shrink. When they sit still, with dignity, and let the world come face to face with itself. And this time, the world listened.